The snow came early that year, not soft, but hard, like a fist closing around the town. It didn't blanket the bluff in silence, it choked it. The saloon door didn't just swing open. It slammed against the wall with a crack that silenced the whole room. Calder Boone didn't lift his head from his cup. He didn't have to. The silence told him everything. This wasn't irregular. This was trouble. Someone near the bar muttered it, low and urgent. "You best come see what's begging behind the butchers." The man paused, his voice dropping even lower. "It ain't no dog." Calder set his tin cup down, the metal scraping against the wood. He hadn't said more than 3 words all week. He was a man made of silence and old grief. The fire at his boots crackled, hungry. Outside, the wind was a wild thing, pulling at the town's edges, making the frozen laundry dance like ghosts on the line. Calder didn't reach for a coat. The cold inside him was older and deeper than any winter. Behind the butcher shop, it was a graveyard of scraps and bones. The air was thick with the smell of what gets thrown away. And crouched there, like small forgotten spirits, were 5 children. They weren't just cold, they were hollowed out by it. The oldest, a girl with hair like frozen rope, was trying to brush snow off a crust of bread. A little boy next to her licked a rind of cheese, his tongue finding no flavor, only memory. Another had no shoes, his feet blue against the dirty white snow. Then a woman stepped out from the shadows of the building. Her hair was matted under a bonnet stiff with ice. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes met Calder's, and something deep inside him, a thing he thought he'd buried years ago, stirred in its grave. The oldest girl, the one with the bread, stood up. Her voice was thin but steady, as if she'd practiced the words. "May we have your leftovers?" Calder's gaze swept over them. Not one of them looked older than 10. The woman held a baby, barely wrapped, its face a pale little moon. It was like the snow hadn't even bothered to fall on them, like the town hadn't even bothered to see them. "You there, Ma?" Calder's voice was rust, low and cracked from disuse. The woman just nodded, her lips split and bleeding. He took off his hat. It wasn't kindness, not yet. It was a sign that he saw them, that they were real. Then he turned, without another word, and walked straight back across the street. When he came back, he was carrying a heavy sack. Bread, jerky, apples that had gone soft but were still good. He didn't hand it to the woman. He handed it to the girl who had asked. Ruth, he would learn her name was later. The way her small, trembling hands took the weight of that sack would stay with him for the rest of his life. "You got a place to sleep?" he asked, the words hanging in the frozen air. The woman shifted, glancing at her children huddled in the shadows. He gave a single sharp nod. "Mine's past the church. Red roof, split beam on the porch." He paused. "Ain't warm, but it's dry." She didn't thank him. There was no room for thanks. She just gathered her children like they were scattered leaves in the wind and herded them away. He watched them go. One of the little ones stumbled and fell, but made no sound. The baby let out a tiny whimper, a sound that was too weak to be a real cry. The snow kept falling, heavy and relentless, and before he could even draw another breath, their footprints were gone. They had vanished. But by morning, the town had found its voice, and it wasn't a kind one. "You see who's in Boone's barn?" The whispers started at the general store and spread like a sickness. 5 of 'em, filthy as sewer rats. Then came the twist of the knife. "That's Reverend Mercer's girl, Hazel, the one who ran off with that gambler, Earl Summers." The name was spat out like poison. "Thought she was dead, should have stayed that way." Calder heard it all. He stood on the grocer's porch, buying nails he didn't need, and let the words wash over him. He didn't flinch. He just paid his coin, his calloused fingers steady, and walked back out into the biting cold. He knew right then, this wasn't just about a woman and her children. This was about a town's long memory, and its even longer grudge. That afternoon he went to the barn. The door groaned, heavy with frost. Inside, the only warmth was the steam of their breath, rising in faint clouds from where they huddled in the hay. Hazel sat bolt upright, her spine a steel rod. The baby was clutched to her chest, a tiny, precious bundle. The other children were asleep in a heap, their small bodies tangled together for warmth. "Didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice a ghost in the cold air. "I did," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle, 2 thick wool blankets, a tin of beans, a jar of lard. Simple things, life-saving things. One of the children, a boy of about 6, stirred. His eyes flew open, wide and dark and silent. He just stared. Hazel didn't introduce them. Calder didn't ask their names. He just asked the one question that mattered. "You plan to move on?" Hazel looked down at her hands, her knuckles white. "Not sure there's anywhere to go." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything they couldn't say. Calder leaned against a wooden post, the damp from his boots seeping into his socks. He didn't care. "They won't let you be," he said, his voice flat. "This town, it don't forget things, especially things that make 'em feel better about themselves." A smile, thin and sharp as a shard of ice, touched Hazel's lips. "I stopped waiting on their kindness a long time ago." That night, Calder found himself fixing the hinges on the barn door. He didn't ask, he just did it. He told himself it was for the livestock, but he hadn't kept any animals in that barn since his wife died. The truth was, he was fortifying it. He was building a wall not just against the cold, but against the town. He woke the next morning to a sound he hadn't heard in 7 years. Laughter. It was so foreign it took him a moment to place it. It sounded like a bird from a country he'd forgotten existed. Ruth and another girl were playing with a piece of twine, their fingers weaving intricate shapes in the air, whispering rules only they understood. Hazel was brushing the girl's tangled hair with a broken comb. Calder watched from his porch. He saw Ruth look over at him, her game pausing for just a second. Then she waved, a small, hesitant wave. He slowly raised his hand in return. Later that day, Hazel came to him. The silent boy was with her. "This is Jonas," she said. Her voice was different now, not so brittle. "He don't talk, but he sees everything." Calder knelt down so he was on the boy's level. "That's so?" Jonas looked at him, his dark eyes solemn, and nodded once. "You see that wood pile is low?" Calder asked, pointing. Jonas looked. He nodded again. "Think you can help me with that?" Another nod. Hazel blinked, fast, like she was trying to hold something back. "Thank you," she whispered. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. "You want to stay longer. That roof needs thatching before the spring melt." Hazel's eyes searched his face, looking for the catch. "You offering work or charity?" "Neither," he said. "Just space." She hesitated, her gaze drifting back toward the barn, toward the town that lay waiting beyond his fence line. "People will talk," she said. "They always do." That evening, Hazel was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the filthy barn floor. When she looked up, a pail of lye soap and a stiff bristled brush were sitting by the door. Calder had left them without a word. When he came back later, she was humming. It was an old song, a tune about rivers and promises. Her voice was cracked and worn, but it filled the cold space with a strange, forgotten warmth. The children were asleep, curled up under the patched quilts he hadn't used since his wife was alive. He found himself staring at them. The youngest, a little girl named Mabel, was still clutching a crust of bread in her fist, even in sleep, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real, as if she was terrified someone would take it away. Hazel saw him looking. "She hoards what's given," she said softly. "Always afraid it'll be taken back." Calder cleared his throat. The sound was rough. "That ain't right." "No," she agreed, "but it's what she knows." He looked at her then, really looked. Her face was etched with lines that a woman of 28 shouldn't have. Her hands were raw, but her eyes were like a deep river that hadn't quite frozen over. He walked back to his empty house. The firelight flickered in the windows, making the shadows dance. But tonight, the silence wasn't a comfort. It was an echo. It was the sound of being alone. The next morning, Ruth was waiting for him on the porch. She was holding his heavy winter coat. "Mama says it's too fine for us," she said, holding it out to him. He took it from her small hands. "You ain't trash," he said, the words coming out sudden and fierce. She blinked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Don't you let anyone tell you different." She nodded, but as she turned to go, he saw her shoulders curl inward, a habit of trying to make herself small, invisible. He watched her run back to the barn, her bare feet leaving prints in the fresh snow. That night, a pair of small, worn but sturdy boots appeared outside the barn door. He never said they were from him, and Hazel never said she knew. The town kept talking, of course. But the whispers got a little quieter when Calder walked by. He never raised his voice. He never clenched his fists. He just looked them straight in the eye, and that was enough to make them look away. By the third night, the baby, Mabel, had stopped crying. She slept with a full belly, her little cheeks finally rounding out. Calder stood in the barn doorway, hat in his hands, watching the lantern light play across Hazel's face as she rocked the baby, whispering a story about the stars. The snow was falling harder, a thick white curtain cutting them off from the rest of the world. But inside that barn, it was warm. It was safe. He stepped back into the darkness and quietly shut the door. But safety is a fragile thing. The next morning, when Hazel walked to the well, she saw it. Scratched into the side of the grocer's wall in jagged, angry letters was a single word. A word meant to tear her down, to remind her of what they thought she was. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But that night, when Calder brought them fresh bread and a new spool of thread, she looked him in the eye, her own gaze hard as flint. "They'll never forgive me for needing help," she whispered. And Calder, a man who had buried his own wife, a man who hadn't believed in a single damn thing for 7 long years, said, "Let 'em choke on it." And from the shadows of the barn behind him, Ruth laughed. It was a real laugh, full of life, so bright and clear it felt like it could melt the snow. Calder didn't laugh back, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, a silent guardian in the swirling dark, and for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like a promise. The barn settled under the weight of the night. The wind pulled at the rafters, making them groan like an old man trying to stand. Hazel sat with her back against a stall, the baby, Mabel, sleeping warm against her chest. She wasn't crying. She'd used up all her tears years ago. She'd cried when her husband Earl first hit her. She'd cried when her daughter Ruth stopped calling her Mama and started whispering, "Don't wake him." She'd cried when Jonas stopped speaking altogether. Now there was nothing left. Now she just had to survive. Calder's lantern cut a bobbing yellow circle in the darkness as he crossed the yard. He always knocked. It was a small thing, but it was everything. It meant this was their space. It meant he respected the fragile walls they'd built around themselves. He was holding a bucket and a long strip of canvas. "Figured that wall dripped tonight," he said, his voice low. Storm's shifting. She stepped aside to let him in. The children were a row of sleeping commas in the hay. Jonas had one arm thrown over his sister, Elma, a silent protector even in his sleep. Calder moved slowly, his big frame careful not to disturb them. He tacked the canvas over a seam in the wall where the wind loved to sneak in. Hazel watched his hands. They were wide and calloused, hands that had built and buried, but they were gentle. "You always work this quiet?" she asked, her voice just a whisper above the wind. He paused, looking up at her from his work. "Noise don't make things faster, just louder." A flicker of a smile touched her eyes. He went back to the wall, pressing the last nail in with the heel of his palm. Then he turned, his gaze falling on the sleeping boy. "Your boy," he said. "Jonas. He ain't sick, is he?" She shook her head. "Not in the body." "Used to speak?" "Yes," she said softly. "He loved birds." Calder nodded. "He still watches everything." "That's how I know he's still in there," she whispered. "Still listening." The barn fell quiet again. Calder straightened up, his back cracking softly. "Got a pot of stew on," he said, not quite looking at her. "If you don't mind stew, that tastes more like bark than beef." Hazel's eyes darted to the sleeping children. He saw the look. "Bring 'em, or come after they're settled. Doors open." He left without waiting for an answer. That was his way. He didn't push. He just made space. Hazel waited. She watched Ruth stir and turn over in her sleep. Then she tucked the baby deeper into the quilts and slipped out of the barn, her feet making no sound on the snow. The house was warm. It smelled of wood smoke and stew. It was a house that had been empty for too long, a house that was holding its breath. Calder sat at the table. There were 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and a loaf of bread already sliced. "Didn't wait," he said. It sounded like an apology. "Didn't expect you to," she replied. She sat down and picked up the spoon. They ate in a silence that wasn't empty. It was watchful. He was trying to remember how to have company. She was trying to remember how to feel safe. "Where'd you learn to thatch a roof?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. "Church roof," she said. "My papa was the preacher. We did for ourselves." He nodded slowly. "Didn't know he had a daughter. He didn't advertise me." "Why?" "Because I ran," she said. The words were simple. True. He leaned back in his chair. "You ran, and then I loved the wrong man. Had children this town never wanted. Lived quiet, then loud, then quiet again." Calder's fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm on the table. "I buried my wife 7 years back," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "Complications in childbirth. Lost the child, too." Hazel closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry. Wasn't your doing." "No," she said softly, opening her eyes. "But I know the sound a house makes when the laughter's gone out of it." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and something in his jaw tightened. A memory, a decision. "You can stay longer," he said, his voice low and firm. "No rent. Just help me keep the place from falling down." "Even when they start whispering," she challenged. "They already are. They'll say you're a fool, taking in a ruined woman with 5 mouths to feed." "I'll take in the ones who looked at me like that girl did behind the butcher's," he said. "And I'll ignore the rest." She stood up then, her bowl empty. She nodded once. "Thank you." He watched her walk back out into the snow, a small determined shadow against the white. By morning, the barn was a different place. Hazel had scrubbed the floors. Ruth was carrying water from the pump. Elma was sorting a jar of bent nails Calder had given her. Jonas followed Calder around the yard, his small shadow mimicking Calder's every move. Days turned into a week. The wind got sharper. One morning, 5 pairs of boots appeared by the barn door, one for each child. Hazel tried to give them back. "They'll just outgrow 'em," Calder said gruffly. "No use returning 'em." She started washing his clothes, hanging them to dry by the small fire he let them build. She mended a tear in his sleeve. He never mentioned it, but she noticed he started wearing that shirt more often. Then the butcher sent his boy over, not out of kindness, but because the town was pressuring him to make a gesture, to smooth things over with the strange, silent man in the big house. The boy, full of his father's spite, sneered at Ruth and threw a bag of scraps at her feet. "Don't eat it all at once, little rats." Before Ruth could even react, Hazel was there. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. "Tell your father we're not charity," she said, her face a mask of stone. "Tell him we eat what we earn." The boy turned pale and ran. When Calder heard what happened, he didn't say a word for a full hour. He just chopped wood, the axe rising and falling with a terrible, controlled fury. Then he came inside and handed Hazel a small, heavy sack of coin. "Buy what you need," he said. She shook her head. "They'll look at me like I stole it." "Then I'll walk beside you." "That'll only make it worse." "Then I'll walk behind you," he said. She didn't smile, but she took the coins. Later that week, Jonas was helping Calder chop wood, mimicking the swing of the axe with a small stick. Calder stopped. "You want to try?" Jonas froze, his eyes wide. He didn't speak. Calder just held out the smallest hand axe. Together, man and boy, they lifted it. The axe came down. The log split clean in two. From the barn doorway, Hazel watched and felt something inside her that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. It wasn't love, not yet. It was safety. It was the feeling of a man standing beside her silent son, not asking for words, just offering strength. That night, Ruth crept onto his porch. She held out a small, crudely carved object. It was a horse. "I made it," she whispered. Calder took it. He nodded. "It's good." He placed it on the mantelpiece in his living room, right where the morning sun would hit it. Hazel saw it there the next day. Weeks passed, quiet weeks, full of things that were never said, but always understood. Then came the night Mabel stopped crying. The baby just lay in Hazel's arms, her breathing shallow, her body terrifyingly still. Hazel held her, rocking back and forth, pressing her lips to the child's cool forehead. Calder stood nearby, his face pale. "Is she—" "She's resting," Hazel said, her voice like brittle glass. "Just resting." And then, a flicker. Mabel's tiny fingers twitched. A soft sigh escaped her lips. Hazel's whole body sagged with relief. She kissed the baby's head, pulling her close. Calder let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Hazel didn't look up at him. She just whispered to the sleeping child, "She only ever stops crying when she feels completely safe." Calder didn't answer. But the next morning, when Hazel stepped out of the barn, she saw it. Nailed to the wall, clean and bold against the weathered wood, was a small, freshly painted sign. It had just one word on it. Mercy. It was the same word she had scratched into the cover of her wedding Bible the night she finally ran away into the dark. She looked toward the house. Calder was standing at the window, watching her, waiting. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just a shelter. It was a reckoning. And it was just beginning. The first thaw came, not with a roar, but with a quiet drip, drip, drip from the eaves. The snow sank into the earth, and the world turned to mud. But Hazel still hadn't crossed the threshold of Calder's house. She swept his porch. She patched a hole in the barn roof with canvas he left for her. She washed his shirts and hung them on the line, her hands turning red in the cold water. but she never sat in the chair he offered by the fire. She never drank from the second tin mug he started leaving on the stove. She existed on the edge of his life, a ghost haunting the edges of his property, belonging to no one, not even herself. Calder watched her. He didn't push. He just left the door open. The children, though, were a different story. They were like seeds taking root in new soil. Ruth took over feeding the chickens. Elma made little families out of pine cones on the windowsill. Jonas started humming, a low, tuneless sound that filled the air with a life it hadn't had in years. Mabel, her cheeks now round and full, learned to laugh. Still, Hazel kept her distance. She was a woman braced for the next blow. In town, the whispers continued. That preacher's daughter, she's got him wrapped around her finger. Ruined woman. Bet not all them kids are from that gambler neither. Calder Boone's gone soft in the head, letting trash like that live on his land. Hazel heard it all. She'd walk into the general store, her back straight as a fence post, place her coins on the counter, and walk out without meeting anyone's eyes. One afternoon, Calder met her at the gate as she returned. "Store give you trouble?" he asked. "No more than usual." He didn't press, he just held the gate open for her. "Got time to help me mend the east fence?" "I've got 5 mouths to feed," she said, her voice flat. It meant she had no time for anything but work. "I'll pay you," he said. Her head tilted, a challenge in her eyes. "You trust me to earn?" "You already have." They worked in silence, stretching the wire, driving the posts. Her hands were steady and sure. He paused once and saw her watching a hawk circling high above them. "My wife," he said, his voice quiet. "She used to say spring feels like forgiveness." Hazel didn't look at him. "Forgiveness is slower than that." He nodded once. "Guess it is." That evening, Ruth left another carving on his porch railing. This time it was a bird, its wings tucked as if in mid-dive. "She made it for you," Hazel said later, her arms crossed over her chest as she stood in the yard. "I plan to keep it," he said, picking up the small piece of wood. "You shouldn't." "Why not?" "Because they'll think I'm trying to buy my way in." "You've already earned your place here." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just turned and walked away, back to the safety of the barn. That night, a storm rolled in, thunder rattling the windows. Calder brought a load of extra firewood to the barn. "You ever think about sleeping inside?" he asked, stacking the wood by her small stove. She didn't answer right away. Then, "Not since he left." Her face went hard. "I don't owe you those memories." "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But sometimes they get lighter when you share the weight." She looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms. "I carried her through a river once," she whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "We were hiding from Earl. I slipped on the rocks. I thought I'd lost her, thought she'd float away like everything else." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "I never cried, not even after we made it to the other side. I just kept walking." Calder's voice was low, a rumble in the storm. "That's not weakness, Hazel." She looked up, startled. "Shame is what other people make you feel when they want to feel bigger than you," he said. "You ain't shameful. You're a survivor." She didn't say anything, but for the first time, she didn't look away from his gaze. The next morning, a new spool of thread and 2 jars of strawberry preserves were sitting by the barn door. "He left it for us," Ruth said. Hazel pressed her lips into a thin line. "Nothing is free, Ruth." But later that day, Calder found his mended shirts hanging on the porch railing, the cuffs neatly stitched. By the end of the week, the whispers in town had turned into something uglier. Word got back to Calder that the sheriff had been in the saloon, asking questions. Boone's got squatters. They ain't his kin. He's got no right. That woman, she's cursed the place. Hazel heard it at the well and came back to the ranch with a storm in her eyes. "You're making enemies for nothing," she said, confronting him as he unloaded a sack of feed. "They were never my friends to begin with. You think it doesn't matter what they say? I think the truth is quieter than gossip." "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she hadn't shown before. "You'll regret ever letting us stay." He dropped the feed sack. He stepped closer to her, his shadow falling over her. "You think I haven't known regret before?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I buried a wife and a child on the same damn day. I let a midwife tell me everything was fine because I was too proud to fetch the real doctor. That regret lives in my bones, Hazel." His voice softened. "You and those kids. You ain't regret. You're the first thing that's felt right in 7 years." She swallowed hard, her anger deflating, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. "We won't be a burden. You never were." That night, as lightning split the sky, Hazel stood just outside the barn, watching the light in Calder's window. She didn't go inside the house, but she stepped out from under the barn's overhang and stood in the pouring rain, letting it wash over her until she was soaked to the skin. It felt like a baptism. In town, a group of men were getting drunk in the saloon. One of them was Earl Summers's cousin. "She's poison," he slurred, slamming his mug on the bar. "The way she's got her hooks in that man. Someone needs to handle the Boone problem." The next morning, Calder found Hazel in the small garden she'd started, planting onions. He held out a folded piece of paper. "Sheriff's coming next week," he said. "Wants to talk about property rights." Hazel stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. "He'll only take us if I let him." "And will you?" Calder asked. He looked at her, at the way the sun caught the stray hairs around her face. "You came here belonging to no one," he said. "But this land knows your hands now, Hazel, and so do I." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "That doesn't mean we're safe." "No," he said, "but maybe it means we're home." She turned and looked toward the barn. Through the open door, she could hear the children laughing. Ruth was trying to teach Jonas how to whistle. "Home," she repeated the word, as if tasting it for the first time. She started walking, not toward the barn, but toward the house. She paused at the porch steps, her hand resting on the railing. Calder watched her, his heart in his throat. "If they come," she said, her voice clear and strong across the yard, "I won't let them take us." "And if they bring the law," Calder called back. "Then we'll show them," she said, a fire lighting in her eyes he had never seen before. "We'll show them that mercy isn't a crime." She held his gaze for a long moment. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. And then she walked up the steps and into his house. The wind finally died. After weeks of rattling the windows and clawing at the roof, the silence that fell over the ranch was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. Hazel stood in the kitchen, barefoot, a dusting of flour on her apron. She was stirring a pot of beans with one hand and rocking a sleeping Mabel with the other. A stray piece of her braid had come loose and stuck to her cheek. She was humming. It was an old tune, a hymn her mother used to sing while sweeping the church floors. She didn't even realize she was doing it. But in the next room, where Calder was fixing a loose floorboard, the sound of his hammering stopped. He froze, hammer in midair. The soft, sad melody drifted down the hallway and wrapped around him. She kept humming. The house, which had been as silent as a grave for 7 years, started to breathe again. When Calder walked into the kitchen, she startled, the humming stopping abruptly. "Sorry," she murmured, suddenly embarrassed. Don't be, he said, his voice rough. The house felt warmer when you were singing. She looked at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. I mean it, he said. She folded a dishcloth, her hands needing something to do. My mama used to say, a woman starts singing when she starts remembering who she is. Calder leaned against the doorframe. And you? Have you remembered? Not yet, she said softly, but the notes are coming easier. That night, the house was full of small, perfect sounds. Ruth was reading aloud from a battered book she'd found. Calder was carving a new slat for the porch railing. Elma had her head in Hazel's lap, her fingers tangled in her mother's skirt. Jonas was staring into the fire, the flames dancing in his silent eyes. You don't flinch anymore, Calder said quietly, his eyes never leaving his carving. Hazel looked up from stroking Elma's hair. You used to, he said, when a door shut too loud, or when my boots hit the floor hard. She swallowed. I still feel it, she confessed. The flinch is just on the inside now. That's strength, he said. She gave a small, bitter laugh. That's survival. They're different things. He didn't argue. He just kept carving. But the next morning, the town reminded them just how different those two things were. A woman at the well whispered it to Hazel, just loud enough for Ruth, who was standing right beside her, to hear every word. Men don't marry shadows, dear, especially not shadows that come with another man's children. Hazel didn't say a word, neither did Ruth. But on the walk home, the girl's hands were trembling so hard she spilled half the water from the bucket. Back at the house, Ruth wouldn't eat. She just sat on her cot, staring at the wall. Hazel sat down beside her. Say it, Ruth. The girl's eyes filled with tears. They hate us, she whispered. Hazel brushed the hair from her daughter's face. That's not your burden to carry. It's yours, Ruth choked out. But I feel it too. Hazel's throat tightened. There was no lie she could tell that would make it better. That evening, she found Calder fixing the hinge on the back door. Do you regret it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up from his work. Regret what? This, letting us stay, letting them talk. His gaze was steady. I regret that this is the world you have to live in, but I don't regret holding the door open for you. The sheriff is still coming, she said. He'll come, Calder agreed. The town won't let him forget. What will you do? He wiped his greasy hands on a rag. What I should have done a long time ago. Before she could ask what he meant, the baby started crying from the other room. I'll get her milk, she said, turning away. He watched her go, a hard, determined line setting in his jaw. 2 days later, Elma started coughing. It was a dry, rattling sound that shook her small body. By nightfall, she had a raging fever. Hazel sat with her all night, pressing cool cloths to her forehead. Calder brought hot bricks from the hearth, wrapped in wool to warm her feet. Jonas sat at the end of the bed, a silent, worried sentinel. She needs a doctor, Calder said at dawn. Hazel shook her head, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. Dr. Fields won't come out here. Not for us. Calder didn't say another word. He just put on his coat, saddled his horse, and rode out into the gray morning. He came back an hour later, and Dr. Fields was riding behind him. The doctor was grim-faced, but he came inside. He did what he could. By evening, the fever had broken. Elma's breathing eased, her color returned, and Hazel finally broke. She didn't sob or scream. She just sat in a chair by the bed and wept, silent tears rolling down her face and soaking the front of her dress. Calder came and put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She's stronger than she looks, he said softly. Hazel looked up at him, her vision blurred. They all are. He knelt down in front of her. So is their mother. Later that night, Hazel stood alone in the kitchen. The moon cast long shadows across the floorboards. Her hand traced the worn grain of the wooden table. A home. He had built this place with his own hands. And now, plank by plank, he was building them a life. She started to sing again. The hymn filled the house, seeping into the corners that had been dark for so long. Standing in the darkened hallway, listening, Calder closed his eyes. Her voice wasn't just a melody. It was the sound of a woman starting to believe she deserved to be saved. But in town, under the cold light of that same moon, the sheriff was packing his saddlebags. He was riding out at first light. The first real snow of winter began to fall, silent and heavy, swallowing the world in white. It fell like a judgment. Calder stood at the window, watching the storm build. "They'll come today," he said, his breath fogging the glass. Behind him, Hazel clutched Mabel tighter. She didn't have to ask who they were. She knew. The sheriff hadn't given them a date. He just let the threat hang in the air, a promise made to the snarling whispers in the saloon. Enough was enough. A strange man, a ruined woman, 5 children that weren't his. It was a story the town had twisted into something ugly and unnatural. Calder was a man who had faced down charging lines in the war, a man who had buried his own family with his bare hands. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of Hazel in the dim morning light, her face pale, her body braced for a fight she shouldn't have to fight. "I can go," she said, her voice small. "We can just go." "No," Calder said. The word was final. "You don't owe us this." "I didn't do this because I owed you anything, Hazel. I did it because it was right." She turned to face him then, and he saw the cracks in the armor she wore so well. "If they take us," she whispered, "they'll shame you." "I was already shamed," he said, his voice raw. "I was shamed the day I let my wife die and shut myself off from the world. Let them talk. They can't say anything worse than what I've already said to myself." A sharp, heavy knock echoed through the house. It wasn't loud. It was official. Ruth jumped. Jonas dropped the piece of wood he was carving. Hazel squeezed her eyes shut. Calder walked to the door and opened it. The sheriff stood on the porch, flanked by 3 other men. 2 were deputies. The third was a local rancher, a man whose eyes had always slid past Hazel as if she were invisible. Snow collected on the brims of their hats. "Calder," the sheriff said, his voice polite but firm. "We've got concerns." "I figured. Word is you're sheltering a woman and 5 children. No blood ties, no legal papers." "I am." "That's unlawful harboring, Calder. You know that." "They're here by my invitation." "That ain't how the law works," the sheriff said, his patience thinning. "It's how decency works," Calder shot back. One of the deputies shifted his weight, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "I need to speak to the woman," the sheriff said. Calder didn't move an inch. "You speak to me." "Can't do that, Boone. She has to speak for herself." That's when Hazel stepped forward, the baby a silent bundle in her arms. "I'll speak," she said. Her voice was clear and steady. It didn't tremble. "My name is Hazel. These are my children. We have lived like ghosts, sleeping in barns and eating what we could find. I have been called names that would make your soul shrink. But I have never harmed anyone. I have never asked for anything." She took a step closer, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "I came to this town starving. My children were picking through garbage. I asked this man for a piece of bread. He gave us a roof. I didn't ask for pity. He gave us dignity. And now you've come here to take that away." The sheriff's gaze faltered. He looked away. "I won't fight you," Hazel said. "But I will not walk out of this house in shame. Not anymore." Behind her, Ruth moved to stand by Calder's side. Jonas followed, his small hand finding Calder's. Elma and Silas pressed against their mother's legs, a small defiant wall of flesh and blood. And that's when Calder's voice cut through the tension, sharp and final. "She bears my name." The sheriff frowned. "Say again." "She bears my name," Calder repeated, his voice ringing with authority. He stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from inside his coat. "As of this morning, I signed the license with the Reverend before dawn." He held it out. "Her name is Hazel Boone. These children are Boones. This is their legal home, same as it's mine." A stunned silence fell over the porch. The deputy took the paper, his eyes scanning the official script, the fresh ink. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff muttered, scratching the back of his neck. The rancher next to him just scowled. "Guess that changes things," the sheriff said. He tipped his hat, not to Calder, but to Hazel. "Ma'am." They turned and walked away, their boots crunching in the snow, their shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Calder shut the door. The silence in the room was deafening. Hazel just stood there, motionless. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I did," Calder said, turning to face her. "Not to protect you from them, but to tell the whole world that you're mine." That's when Ruth started to cry. Quietly at first, then she buried her face against Calder's side and sobbed. Jonas, the silent boy, reached up and squeezed Calder's hand. Elma climbed into her mother's arms, her small face pressed against Hazel's neck. That night the fire burned bright in the hearth. The storm raged outside, but inside the house there was only peace. Hazel sat in the old rocking chair, Mabel asleep in her lap. The other children were dozing on a thick rug before the fire. The house was breathing again. It was full of life. Calder stood in the doorway, watching them, watching his family. "You married me in name only," Hazel said softly, her eyes on the flames. "I married you in winter," he replied, walking into the room. "Things that grow in winter put down the deepest roots." She looked up at him, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. "And in the spring?" she asked. "In the spring," he said, gently taking the sleeping baby from her arms, "we build." He looked around the warm, full room, at the children sleeping safely, at the woman who had brought his house and his heart back to life. Together. Outside, the snow kept falling, but it wasn't burying the world anymore. It was giving it a clean, new start. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the coldest winter, kindness can build a home.